for water, but you cannot eat or drink in here. We need you to do that in the white gallery space or take to go, all right? And for those of you who are standing, if you would like, you can go upstairs and sit in this back area of the upper level. Just watch the cords for the lighting as you walk past. So the stairs are right around this corner, so you can do that. These are wonderful problems to have from a programming perspective when you have a packed house. Okay. Because we are live streaming this, we are going to start our program. So if you can find a comfortable place, I see people are finding their way upstairs. So good evening and welcome. My name is Zahir Ali. I am the inaugural executive director of the Hutchins Institute for Social Justice, which is housed here in the Hutchins Center at the Lawrenceville School. I would like to welcome you all to tonight's program. The Hutchins Institute for Social Justice is an innovative secondary school initiative supporting social justice teaching and practice through scholarship, programming, and experiential learning. As part of our mission, we are honored tonight to be joined by Lawrenceville's very own Dr. Stacey Patton, class of '96, who is helping us to launch what will be the first of our mini residency series. These mini residencies are designed to bring social justice artists, activists, scholars, and practitioners to campus to help us deepen our understanding, exchange ideas, and promote community-centered and impact-focused work. As part of her mini residency today, Dr. Patton has presented to our school-wide school meeting. She has taught a class in U.S. history. She has met with students at lunch, and she is capping off the evening with this presentation of her scholarship. So we have put her to work. Before we proceed, I want to point out, some of you have seen the two murals at the back of this room. This is the work of our student community from Martin Luther King Day. We focused our study, discussion, and art around King's letter from Birmingham jail. And so each student had a tile that they were to design inspired by what they learned and talked about King's letter. And so each tile formed the image. And so on one panel is a photograph of King in the jail of Birmingham. And on the other panel is the arrest shot of King when he was arrested in Birmingham. So after tonight's program, feel free to mull around and look at all of the wonderful ways our students were engaged with King's letter from Birmingham jail. And finally, before proceeding, nothing is possible without community. And I am thankful to the community here at the Lawrenceville School who have made this event possible. I am going to try to read as many names as I can. If I miss someone, charge it to my mind, not my heart. So of course, I'd like to thank head of school, Steve Murray, for supporting the work of the Institute and all of the ideas that we are coming up with. I want to thank all of the deans, Dean Emily Kossoff, the Dean of Faculty, Dean Allison Easterling, the Dean of Academics, Dean Devondra McMillan, Dean of Students, Dean Cameron Brickhouse, Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Did I say that right, or I got it reversed? And, sorry, diversity, inclusion, and community engagement. There you go. I'd like to thank Dr. Nuri Friedlander, who is the Director of Equity and Inclusion. Yes. I want to thank Ian August from the Dean of Students Office, who always has his hands and fingers on the pulse of student life to help us program. I want to thank Karen Redding for her assistance with logistics. I want to thank the IT team for their support for making this live stream possible, and our communications department for their collaboration. There are many, many more. And of course, I want to thank all of you for attending on a Friday evening when it is raining and cold outside, on the eve of winter gathering when many students seek to leave campus. I am so honored that you have decided to join us today. Now on to the business at hand. I am going to read Dr. Patton's bio because I believe in giving people their flowers while they are with us. And she ain't going nowhere, but. Dr. Stacey Patton is an award-winning journalist, author, nationally recognized child advocate, and college professor. Her writings on race, higher education, culture and politics, and child welfare issues have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC News, Al Jazeera, and other outlets. She has appeared on MSNBC, CNN, ABC News, Democracy Now!, Fox News, and other outlets. She is the author of That Mean Old Yesterday, a memoir, which some of you got a glimpse into this morning at the school meeting, and Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. And the forthcoming, which you're getting a sneak preview today, Strung Up, the Lynching of Black Children in Jim Crow America. She is the creator of SpareTheKids.com, an online portal designed to teach parents about the harms of hitting children. Dr. Patton is also the creator of the forthcoming 3D interactive medical animation app called When You Hit Me, scheduled for release in April 2022. She is also a research associate professor at the Morgan State University's Institute for Urban Research, and she teaches digital journalism at Howard University. Dr. Patton graduated from the Lawrenceville School in 1996. As a student, she played soccer, basketball, and ran track. She was also a member of the Lawrenceville Singers and Gospel Choir, the African American and Latino Alliance, and she graced the stage numerous times as a Woodrow Wilson public speaking finalist. After graduating from Lawrenceville, Dr. Patton attended Johns Hopkins University, New York University, and Rutgers University, where she earned her PhD in African American history. She worked as a journalist for the Baltimore Sun, Washington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and as a writer for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, prior to entering higher education as a professor. When I first met her, through Zoom, of course, we had a conversation of the work that she would like to present. And then I asked her, what would she like the students to hear? And she told me her story. And so today we have been fortunate to hear her powerfully transformative story. And now tonight, we're going to get a glimpse into her groundbreaking scholarship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stacey Patton.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's really good to be back here, to be back home, to kick off Black History Month and the inaugural lecture for the Hutchins Institute for Social Justice's first mini residency. I'd like to do a little icebreaker with everybody in the room. I have a very powerful, simple sentence that I'd like for everybody to repeat. Is everybody ready to do this? Yeah. Are you ready? Yeah. I still don't believe you. Are you ready? Yes. Okay. So I need you to say this sentence with passion, okay? All right, 1, 2, 3. Childhood is about surviving adults. Okay, and so I want you to hold on to that as we take this journey into a chamber of horrors. Everything you're going to see and hear tonight is deeply disturbing, but we must face this history because we're living in a racial moment in this country where evil is on the verge of being repeated. And with that, I want to begin the story of American lynching in an unanticipated place, with children. Children played a startlingly significant role in the drama of American lynching, not only as victims, but as perpetrators in training. Children were not simply victims of racism, they were central to the reproduction of racism and white supremacy after the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so childhood is and has always been the foundational site of white supremacist reproduction in American life. And that remains true to this day. And so what you're going to see tonight is how white children had to be made into instruments for the enforcement of non-humanity in their black peers through their exposure to racialized, psychopathological community violence. I want to start off by showing you a video presentation that I put together. My project is a heartbreaking story. It is a chamber of horrors. It's about the untold numbers of black children who were lynched during America's Jim Crow era. And it'll be the first scholarly work centered primarily on the lynching of black children and the intergenerational impact these unprosecuted murders had on Black families and communities. Black children are and have always been a threat to the continuity of white supremacy. They've been treated as enemy combatants in the same brutal manner as their elders. The young victims I write about were from various regions of the country. They were teenagers, adolescents, infants. My youngest victims include 9 fetuses. This project is also about the psychological destruction of white children who witnessed, participated in, and instigated lynchings. The capacity to engage in collective homicide transcended age. Black and white children were not simply bystanders who were swept up in racial violence. They were the fulcrum on which the story of American race turns. To perpetuate white supremacy for a future without end, all childhoods had to be destroyed in different ways. Lynching enabled white parents and children to form bonds of solidarity. And what this project has taught me is that white supremacy is primarily sustained by bonds of love, a perverse and violent expression of love. In America between 1882 and 1968, and doubtless many more whose names have been lost to history. The courthouse steps, town squares, public parks, rivers, swamps, and woodlands of the southern countryside hold the tales of hundreds, perhaps thousands of Black youths whose bodies were thrust into watery graves, strung up on unoffending bridges, trees, telephone poles, tortured, beaten, roasted on pyres, dragged, shot to death, sliced up and stored in jars of formaldehyde to be preserved as gruesome souvenirs. The savagery was a direct result of Black laborers disputing wages while working under the foulest conditions, or being accused of various crimes, or acting uppity, trying to educate themselves, talking back to whites, or trying to vote, preventing the rapes of girls and women, or resisting all other kinds of social abuses, or for nothing at all. So tonight I would like for us to focus on the presence of white children at these ghastly crime scenes. I want you to see them skipping, running, jumping, cheering, laughing, collecting materials for bonfires, scratching, kicking, and spitting on Black victims, sitting on top of lynching trees, posing with corpses, standing over the ashes of victims, slicing and selling off body parts, bones, teeth, genitals. So let us ask ourselves some important questions. Why did white adults so often bring their children, including babies, to lynchings? Why were white youth essential as witnesses and active participants? Some white Southerners did not regard lynchings as horrible events that children should be shielded from. Instead, they were exciting events that neither they nor their children should miss. What do these family outings reveal about white parenting and the poisonous pedagogy that traumatized their own children? What impact did exposure to lynchings have on white children's psychological well-being and the moral development of generations of white children who grew up in a not too distant past and may still be walking amongst us today? So I want you to look at this picture. This is a powerful cartoon from 1934, drawn by a famous artist, Reginald Marsh. I first stumbled across this picture while I was in the Moreland Spingarn archives at Howard University. And when I pulled this out of an old envelope, it punched me in the gut. So we see a crowd of townspeople at a lynching. There's a glow off to the side here. Victim is being lynched and burned. So a luminous glow of light directs the viewer's eyes to the little girl who's engulfed in the flow of contorted bodies, losing control of themselves. The light draws us closer to her face and body. And if we really look at her, she looks tranquil. I see no fear on her face. She exudes the kind of curiosity you would see from a child taken to a parade, the zoo, or some other kind of fun spectacle. How old do you think this child is? 5, 6, 7 maybe. When you look at her face, what do you see? Do you see innocence being destroyed? Or do you see a little girl who's already a racist psychopath? What do you think is happening inside her body and her still developing brain as this violent scene unfolds in this carnival-like atmosphere? When I first saw it, I thought, look at this creepy little girl. That's what I mumbled to myself while I was sitting at the archives. But I eventually had to pause and draw on child development and social neuroscience research to understand her reaction through a more informed lens. This child's brain did not know that it was going to be born into a racist, homicidal environment. But the brain is an amazingly flexible organism which intuitively makes adaptations based on our experiences. So knowing this, I had to see this little girl as a biological creature embedded in a family, in a community, in a social network, and a culture shaping her developmental trajectory. And I had to ask some really important questions about her cognitive and social development and her brain's ability to even process this public murder as evil. So I said, why isn't she wincing? Why isn't she crying? Why isn't she turning away, covering her eyes, her nose, her ears? Why isn't she trying to wiggle down from the adult's perch? Wouldn't a healthy child's response to the visual, olfactory, and acoustic stimuli of her first lynching be the opposite of this child's? So what I see here is a child who is deeply connected to a caregiver who is exposing her to psychological abuse through witnessing racial terror. Look at the joyful mother with her wide eyes and gaping hole for a mouth, normalizing this spectacle of cruelty and death. See how proudly she hoists this child above the noisy crowd for a prime viewing spot so she can see the black body being roasted. The girl sits up there calmly, one finger pressed against her chin in a thoughtful, mature way as she takes in this new experience. Since her caregiver is present, she can assume that she's safe because of the emotional and engagement cues that she receives, smiling, vocalizing, eye contact, being held. This is part of the normalization process that helps children determine how to interpret and react to situations happening around them. A sense of belonging to a local community is happening here. There's something communal and shared going on. There's bonding, there's release of anxiety. There's a culture reinforcing the learning of race through collective homicide. The girl in Marsh's drawing is not a mentally healthy child. Curiosity is her overriding emotion, and given the horror she is witnessing, we've got to ask ourselves, what happened to this little girl before this moment? What happened to her that in her earlier years that has her responding to a ghastly murder in such a desensitized way? Had she been previously exposed to repeated experiences of neglect, domestic violence at home, sexual abuse, corporal punishment? Had she heard adults at her home or in her community talk about black people or treat them in dehumanizing ways? We'll never know. But despite the drawing's caption, this is her first lynching, it's clear that she must have had substantial socialization, cognitive disruptions with her primary caregivers, or traumatic emotional memories that primed her to categorize this lynching as something other than horror. Ladies and gentlemen, cruelty is learned through the experience of being a victim of cruelty. And so here we can see in Reginald Marsh's cartoon how racial violence is normalized with parental approval, community support, and perhaps previous trauma exposure. The observation of racial violence should be generating toxic stress in this child's body. But in this case, that stress appears to be moderated by her attunement with her joyful and supportive caregiver, her exuberant community, and her perception of what is going on. Consider this. The brain is a social organ. So this child's brain is linked to a network of other psychologically damaged social brains in that crime scene, influencing one another's internal biochemistry, emotions, and behaviors. The mood and messages of the adults at lynchings could regulate white children's initial shock, initial anxieties and fears, and inoculate them against the normal stress responses that would send their bodies into fight or flight mode. So white adults conveyed direct messages to children that the goals of lynching black people were protection from danger or revenge against those who were accused, typically basically, of harming one of their own, or a celebration of white power. This child is at a stage of child development when her primary source of racial learning is being crystallized by the adults in her world. She has not yet started to develop her own social and political and moral views, or to seek greater autonomy away from her parents. Her initiative is to survive. So right now, she is all sensory and driven by a biological desire to identify with her caregivers, to comply with their expectations, and to internalize their messages, and to win their approval and love. Even in abusive parent-child relationships, children continue to form attachment bonds because this is a biologically rooted human process. And so to survive, Reginald Marsh's little girl's brain must adapt to being raised in a toxic environment of cognitively impaired and morally depraved adults and children who normalize the destruction of black bodies for community purification, group solidarity, cathartic release of repressed intergenerational traumas stored up in their own bodies that they bought from Europe to here, and for fun. This is Reginald Marsh. I want you to take a good look at him. So an old picture can provide insight to a culture, beliefs, values, and shows how ordinary people understand their world and connect with others for good or for evil. This is her first lynching was atypical of Reginald Marsh's work, which included integrated scenes of urban life, the seedy side of New York City, beaches, mass transit, dance halls, theaters, people living in impoverished circumstances during the Depression. So I can't tell you whether or not Reginald Marsh intended for viewers to walk away from his drawing with a lesson on child development, attachment and social learning theory, neuroscience, or intergenerational transmission of racism and trauma. But he powerfully illustrated how utterly devastating the practice of bringing children to lynchings would be on a culture, eroding its humanity from the inside out. But at the very least, Marsh's visual commentary indicated a kind of preliminary awareness of what neuroscience suggests to us today about how environment, trauma, and socialization shapes developing brains. This is Reginald Marsh. The archives can be a chamber of horrors, but sometimes you can make unexpected and magical connections. Reginald Marsh attended Lawrenceville and graduated in 1916. 80 years before I did. He was born in Paris. He showcased his artwork right here on campus when he was a student. He was on a full scholarship. He was a member of the Lit and the yearbook club. He got C's and D's. I hope nobody pulls my student record and puts it on a PowerPoint decades from now, because they'll see some stuff. So in his final report, there's this last line. There's this question that asks, what signs of originality, of independence, or of capacity for leadership has he shown? And the answer was, quote, no marked ones. So boy, somebody got that wrong. But in his yearbook portrait, he quoted the famous abolitionist Thomas Higginson, who said, quote, originality is simply a pair of fresh eyes, a pair of fresh eyes. And that's what Marsh brought to our understanding of lynching by centering a child so that we could understand the psychological damage that exposure to racial violence had on young people's developmental trajectories. Lawrenceville's archives revealed that much attention and celebration was given to his work in the decades after he graduated from here. But none of the stories about him, none of the artwork that was showcased, highlighted this is her first lynching and its role in the early civil rights movement in the early 20th century. This piece was the most highlighted art piece in the nation's first ever lynching exhibit, which was held in New York City in 1934. And it was heralded by leaders of the NAACP, and the piece toured multiple cities along the East Coast. The historical record is silent about Marsh's motivations for this work. We don't know why he drew this. He never wrote about lynchings. He never wrote about racism. And there were no black students at Lawrenceville when he attended. In fact, he attended Lawrenceville at a time when racism was very prevalent on campus, when boys openly played racist games like N-word baby. This was a favorite pastime at carnivals, festivals, so you'd have black people's heads in these holes, and people would pay to throw balls or other objects at them. So here are some boys at Lawrenceville playing the same game, but with their backsides turned up. So I must show gratitude to Reginald Marsh for leaving behind a visual record that allows me, nearly 90 years later, to build a devastating portrait of children and lynching in American culture. Though Marsh powerfully dramatized the haunting brutality of racial violence, there's no biographical evidence that he ever witnessed an actual lynching. He didn't simply document the presence of children at lynchings. He was showing an intergenerational process by capturing the interactive role between white adults and children as fundamental aspects of these atrocities. His drawing had gained such notoriety that it inspired a similar drawing that was published on November 23, 1935 in the Houston Informer, which was a black-owned newspaper in Texas. Unlike Marsh's illustration, the Houston Informer cartoon was a direct commentary on an actual lynching of 2 black teens from Columbus, Texas on November 12, 1935. These boys, 15-year-old Ernest Collins and 16-year-old Benny Mitchell Jr., were illiterate farmhands who had been accused falsely of raping and murdering the local high school valedictorian. After signing confessions with the letter X, the boys were chained neck to neck and seized by vigilantes during a nighttime transport to a county jail, and they were taken to a rural intersection a few miles from downtown Columbus and hung from a large oak tree that was illuminated by automobile headlights in front of a mob of 700 white adults and children. The faded photograph that you see here was taken of the corpse suspended from the tree. Copies of this picture were distributed around the community. The 2 nooses were taken into the main section of town and placed in a drugstore window where they were viewed by hundreds of curious people. The teenagers' bodies were returned to their parents, who refused them out of fear for their own safety. So imagine your children are killed and you can't even give them a proper burial. So Collins and Mitchell were buried in unmarked graves. So here's that cartoon that was inspired by Reginald Marsh's cartoon a year earlier. So here, in a sarcastic jab at the pretensions of Southern hospitality, which rest on the foundation of racial terror, the Houston Informer ran this cartoon image under a headline, quote, "An introduction to culture of the Southern variety." So this cartoon echoes Marsh's drawing with slight variations. So we see 2 white women and a little girl standing by a large tree where the bodies of these teenage boys are hanging. And so one woman, who's likely the child's mother, has seized the child's head with one hand, presumably twisted it around to force her to look at the bodies. She says to the other woman, perhaps in a very matter-of-fact tone, her first time. So this language suggests a past when lynchings were common, socially accepted communal rites of passage for children, as well as a future in which they will remain common. Her first time, her first lynching, supposes that there will be others and assumes that the older women had witnessed multiple lynchings themselves. So the firm hand on the child's head suggests that she must watch, so that she could become desensitized to the murder of black people and understand her role in safeguarding the future of white supremacy. Think about how many little children were absolutely shocked and horrified by these scenes when they first saw them. So if you look very closely at lynching photographs, you can actually see some of the children with glazed over eyes and frozen postures, mixed in with the grinning youngsters proudly posing for the camera. Their stressed bodies of some children were in conflict with their social world, which told them that lynchings were normal. So I'm thinking about the murders of Lige, Daniel, Reuben, Stacy in these photographs. And so we look at the expressions and body language of those children, with some of them thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of torture and death. These allow us to see the successful indoctrination by the adults in their world. What we see in these cartoons that I showed you and the photographs are white parents enlisting children into this evil decadence by forcing them to watch and even participate so that they would experience less emotional arousal in response to the killing of Black people and would become morally disengaged. And less scientifically, it showed them what side they were expected to be on. They were educational moments and indoctrination into the fraternity of whiteness. Lynching was seen by its defenders as a heroic act and an expression of popular democracy, rooted in a tradition of other sorts of collective and sometimes revolutionary violence. That too helped to frame these kinds of experiences as something other than depraved cruelty. So, would these experiences make these children reject racism? Maybe, maybe not. It all depended on the trajectory of their brain development and whether they had corrective emotional experiences to help them create new neural connections and prune away old ones later in adolescence. If their parents and community continued to teach them racist ideas and expose them to racial violence or other types of toxic stress before their brains could fully develop and formulate their own responses, those damaged brain cells would not wither away and die, but would strengthen and become a permanent part of their personality and their schema, which is the mental structures that people use to organize knowledge and guide their cognitive processes and behaviors later in life. So at best, a first lynching taught white children that Black people were not fully human, that it was good to be white and powerful, and to emotionally detach from the suffering of others. At worst, the experience turned white children into psychopathic offenders and bystanders who reenacted racial violence with no remorse. Of course, some white children did not turn into racist killers, despite their caretakers' lack of recognizing the humanity in others. And some who were exposed to racial violence were triggered into activism, into being part of the civil rights movement. This kind of toxic socialization and cognitive desensitization to violence not only distorts young people's reality, but the exposure can also alter their neurochemistry and get transferred across generations. We call this epigenetics, which is a new science that needs another whole lecture. One of the most insidious aspects of white supremacist violence is that it depends upon traumatizing white children to the point at which they can no longer recognize humanity in others. Marsh's drawing and the Houston Informer cartoon might have been personal artistic interpretations, but these depictions were an actual reality for thousands of white children across the country whose parents required their attendance and participation in lynchings. Lynchings were so pervasive and racial violence was so commonplace that it was unremarkable to many whites, particularly in the South. The white community did not see having children witness racial killings as barbaric, but instead embraced the experience for their children as part of a larger protective duty. The African-American journalist and anti-lynching crusader, my shero, Ida B. Wells Barnett, she recognized the damage that exposure to lynchings had on white children who attended the torture and burning of a Black man in 1892 in Memphis. And so she describes the scene of a white child being brought to the front of this barbaric scene. She's maybe 12 years old. And she notes toward the end She's being brought to view a scene which was calculated to drive sleep from the child's eyes for many nights, if not to produce a permanent injury to her nervous system. So she's echoing some of the modern day stuff that we know about trauma exposure. And then there's Walter White. Walter White is African American, even though he looked white to a lot of people, and he investigated lynchings. He almost got himself killed doing this. So he used his skin color to pass in order to investigate lynchings and to come back and report on them. And so he tells this story of going down to Florida, and he's walking along a roadside, and he encounters these 3 white children who are joyful, they're having a good time, and these children ask him if he's going to go see the black people who had been lynched. And so he talks about the damage on the warping of young minds who are exposed to this. He says those experiences may result in arrestation. In the unconscious of these immature minds are sown the seeds of lynching. And then there's this last line here. Such frequently repeated acts, lynchings, cannot fail to shape young minds in molds which seem destined to demand more victims. Destined to demand more victims. That's quite a stunning statement there. So Ida B. Wells and Walter White clearly recognized the evil of racist adults weaponizing their own children at a point in their development when they could not fully conceptualize the harm that they witnessed and perpetuated. Walter White also commented on how messages communicated about race in white homes and schools, quote, took root in the mind of a child and bore unwholesome fruit many years later. So he was drawing upon developmental psychology to punctuate his message, destined to demand more victims. And so Wells and White clearly understood that warping the minds and injuring the nervous systems of children during their early development ensured that racial violence would continue. These 2 African American leaders displayed more care and concern about the psychological health of those white children than their own parents and community did. And so embedded in the visual records of these 2 artists, the reporting of a black journalist and the investigative notes of a civil rights activist is a disturbing truth, ladies and gentlemen, that white supremacy is primarily sustained through bonds of love. Many people desperately believe that Jim Crow racism and the racism that we see today was and is rooted in hateful ideas that circulated in advertising, children's books, movies, household products, toys and games, textbooks, rules of etiquette, and the ideological objectives of adults. For generations, we have focused on hate crimes, hate speech, hateful politics. Historians have linked lynchings to capitalistic transformations, economic issues, weak local criminal justice systems, sexual politics, class, religion, and the emasculation of white males, class and religion. But these explanations overlook how childhood trauma is foundational to white supremacist aggression. All along, it has been the love between white parents and children, a perverse and violent expression of love. That is the real culprit. Whiteness destroys childhood with a perverse love. This perverse love and disrupted attachment between white parents and children later became class and racial fears, the perception of emasculation among white men, psychosocial threats, and other socio-political justifications that were attached to lynchings. But ladies and gentlemen, racism is a disease. The disease is the dehumanizing violence that white children face before they reach their cognitive and social potential, before certain parts of their brain were strong enough for them to develop moral reasoning and a sense of right and wrong. Ida B. Wells and Walter White recognized how legions of whites intuitively understood the importance of christening and baptizing their young in the fire of racial politics before the end of adolescence. and our fellow Lawrentian, Reginald Marsh, so powerfully captured this truth over 80 years ago. And unfortunately, the historical echoes remain with us today. So thank you for listening.
So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. There's another mic as well that we can pass. Does anyone have any questions? Just want to sit with this for a little bit.
The first question's always the hardest. Nobody wants to be the first to ask.
I'll be first. Thank you for sharing one tonight. That's my niece, everyone. I want to say that first of all. So what I'm hearing tonight is that more so than hatred, it was love, which is greater than hate, that has sustained racism. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because love is greater than hate, everyone. Thank you.
But it's a perverse kind of love.
Absolutely.
You know, it's the, coercion and violence against children. I beat you because I love you, right? At a time when your brain is developing. And so the messages of love and violence emerge to become a biological experience. And that shapes your brain, and it shapes the way you understand relationships, yourself in the world. That is my uncle there, and I should tell you that his grandfather was a victim of a near lynching in Mississippi in the early 20th century. They wrapped him, the Ku Klux Klan had tortured him, wrapped him in a sheet and threw him in front of the house. I grew up hearing this story. My biological mother's father, my grandfather, was also killed in a similar way in 1968. So this is not ancient history. And when you lose a family member in this way, there's all these questions about, well, what if, right? What does that do to a family when someone is, stolen in this way? So we've dealt with the generational echoes ever since. There's a question here.
Hello. Sorry. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. The question I have to ask, once again, I'm probably going to say a lot of words, and I hope that the question comes into fruition in speaking. But I was going to say this same curiosity of white children of the past that led to their eventual desensitization. I was going to say that I feel like I see that same curiosity in Black youth when they seek out to learn more about the injustices and prejudices and violence against Black people, and then they become more and more desensitized to the violence and discrimination that happens against them. And I was saying, obviously, curiosity is present in all youth, and I wanted to ask if you knew why the curiosity that's in white youth, why it is that it doesn't present them to ask some of these same questions to their own grandfathers and grandmothers and great-granduncles, because I feel like I've heard a lot of stories and I've asked my own, older family members about their stories of the past. And I know a lot of people of color and Black people say it out loud, but I feel like I never hear about that from white children, and the assumption is they have that same curiosity, so if you could.
So we live in an incredibly violent society. We see violence on loop all the time, whether it was, police shootings of unarmed Black people over and over again. Think about George Floyd and others. Think about violent websites, World Star, where people are fighting. People pick up their cell phones and they film. They don't intervene. They become sort of these passive bystanders. And again, that all starts in childhood when children are exposed to profound violence. But in terms of this history of violence and lynching as it relates to white children, I tell people that lynchings did not begin in America. They did not begin with black people as victims. They actually began in Europe. I had some additional slides, but I knew I was, I'm just flipping through them. But if you can look through the art and see repeated images, ghastly images of white children being exposed to profound violence, rampant infanticide in Europe. It's in the folklores, it's in the folk tales, in the art. It's all over the place. And so this is an intergenerational exposure to violence that becomes embedded in people's culture, and in their, changes their DNA. It changes their thoughts about and treatment of children. And so I can go all the way back to the 19th century, early 19th century in Britain, and see news stories about white children being publicly hanged. So the first victims, if you will, of a different kind of lynching were actually white children. As young as age 6, I found one mass lynching of 10 children. And these children were publicly hanged for arson, poisoning, stealing, a whole range of crimes. And so this was something that was brought here to America to the colonial period. The first child publicly hanged in America was a 14-year-old boy who was caught having sex with animals, which included a chicken. I don't know how he was caught, how he worked that out, but it happened. And so this was a part of a culture that of a long continuation of anti-child violence that began in Europe and then got transferred to other people's children. And so we don't really talk about, white people's ancestral histories of violence and trauma as a starting point for how we deal with the desensitization of violence and the continuation of it and the indifference to other people's suffering. So this is part of facing that history. If we're going to talk about racism and heal racism, we've got to have a conversation about how white children are parented in this country and how that trauma then gets projected onto other people that they're encountering, and how we as African Americans internalize that violence by trying to protect our children from this long ancestral history of European violence by beating our own kids. And calling it love and safety. And then we grow up with anger and rage that sometimes spills out into our own communities. So it's a whole mess of, issues where children are foundational to this continuation of violence and pain. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and speaking with us today. In your presentation, I noticed that many of the photos of the lynchings were of very young children, so from ages 11 up to 16, 17. And you just talked about the lynchings of young white children. And I was wondering if there's a connection in building this kind of trauma and this hate by using children as an example.
So when we look at childhood in Europe, it's a very recent invention, right? So for much of European history, they didn't recognize children as distinct from adults. You look at old paintings, and you see these little bodies with these big heads, and they look like old men, but those are actually children. So they were drawn. There was really no distinction between the two. They needed a whole age of enlightenment to start to recognize that children were even biologically distinct. And childhood in Europe was, violence was endemic to the experiences of children. There are whole books written about the brutality that they experienced. And it's not until about the 16th century that there's this awakening about the nature of children. The writings start to change. They start to look different in the artwork. But this happens also at precisely the same time that we see colonial projects happening. So Africans are taken from the continent and brought here. And so what happens is white Americans here start to model their treatment of black people on the ways in which they used to treat their own white children. And so they had to partially rescue white children from the public brutality that was so endemic in Europe. And so black people became their new children. So if you want to other somebody, you call them a children. And so black people never grow up. There's a lot of talk about the adultification of children in this culture, and black children, but that thesis is completely wrong. So you have somebody like Frederick Douglass who says that his white playmate, who's also his master, he's gonna grow up. But if Douglass is gonna forever, his body will grow, but he'll forever be a boy. And so black children are targeted not because people don't recognize the biological differences between a black adult and a child. They're targeted precisely because they're children, precisely because childhood has always existed in European culture as a place of violence and degradation and enslavement and sexual abuse. It's just that all of that got projected onto black children, while white children were allowed to become adult citizens and have the privileges and responsibility of adulthood that are denied to both black adults and children. So it's a very complicated mess. White supremacy is just messy and contradictory. And I don't even remember the question you asked me because I just went off on a whole bunch of tangents. So I apologize. I hope you found an answer somewhere in there.
You said that.
Where is this voice coming from? Oh, there you are. Okay.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. You said that racial ideas aren't targeted to children, mainly through the primary caretaker, the person they respect the most, the person they look up to, the person they love the most. And I was wondering, what about cases, say, in children, white children, who don't have a primary caretaker? Are they as susceptible to, racial ideology imparted onto them, as well as with a primary caretaker? Is how essential is the primary caretaker and their ideologies to the impartation of them onto the child?
So I'm going to age myself right now, and I don't know why, as you were talking and asking that question, I was thinking about this funny movie called The Jerk. You should know. Does anybody know that movie in here, The Jerk? Okay, so some of you do. And so it's Steve Martin, right? Is it Steve Martin? And he's abandoned by his white parents, and he's raised in a poor black house. He's, and he doesn't really know that he's white, right? And his developmental trajectories are completely different than perhaps if he had been raised by his white families. But I say this because environment is important. So depending on who raised them, if he's raised by racist people, if he's going to school systems that are segregated, that are reinforcing, those messages. So a lot has to do with environment. And if they're not exposed to someone in the environment who shows them a different way, then, the likelihood of them following in that community ethos of racism and violence, they're deeply susceptible to that.
Let me just to get support. So it's you, then you, and then there's a hand up here. Okay. So.
Do you think that the kind of mass media coverage and desensitization of violence in children today, for example, a lot of police brutality, school shootings, stuff that's highly publicized, do you think that that is a manifestation of this kind of violence you're talking about? And if not, do you think there's a connection between this violence that you're talking about?
Absolutely. The viral videos that we see, they're not new. It's just the technology has changed. So back in the day, it was newspapers. Print newspapers would publish these lurid details about lynchings and, racial violence. And so that was the first genre of this kind of viral, racialization of violence. And they did it to sell papers. Lynchings sold newspapers and normalized them. And then people sold postcards. They would show up to take pictures next to hanging bodies, and these things would circulate throughout the country. Hey, this is the barbecue we had last night in Texas. So it was another way of commodifying Black death, but also memorializing it and basically using postcards as a way to say, this was an experience that I had. There's a great book called Without Sanctuary that showcases some of the images that you saw here tonight. So those sorts of things were a precursor to what we're seeing now. There was one story in the archives that I saw. It was a white journalist who went to a lynching. Now imagine that you're a journalist and you're coming to a lynching with your notebook to report on this, right? You're not going to intervene. You're just there to report and get quotes from people, describe the scene. And so while he's there, there's thousands of people at this lynching of a child. And there's a man with his toddler on his shoulders. And as the flames shoot up, they're burning this guy, everybody starts cheering wildly, yay! And the baby starts clapping wildly. And this journalist is stunned. He says, how could this baby, this infant who can't even talk yet, react in this way? So he didn't understand, you know, what we know about neuroscience and mimicking and stuff like that. So this child didn't assign any meaning to this. This child was looking around and mimicking the joy and excitement that was all around him as a toddler. And so that was why it was so important to bring white children very early on and expose them to this violence before they had agency over their brain parts that could make a determination to say, this doesn't look right. Now, if you waited till a child was 12 or 13, later in adolescence, when they have these cognitive abilities in their brains, you might not be able to convince them that this was the right thing to be doing, or that it was fun, or that it was normal. And so when we expose young people to violence through digital devices and technology and video games, that desensitization is kind of going to work. And that's why when we have these real life incidents, there's so many bystanders. There's so many people who just pick up a camera and just start filming rather than intervening.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to say it's like really insightful on how it's, you definitely also create a big shift in framework, because it's this kind of preserve, like, it's love that's kind of driving racism, and I kind of want to talk a bit more about that and how it has, it's not just like in this time period, it's like gone through generations of family, and you said that our brains are like very adaptable, and I was wondering if, you know, right now, can we adapt and undo what this kind of love has done, and especially now where you just said these tools for to desensitize people has also evolved.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And, you know, this is why my work focuses on childhood, because once again, it's the foundational site where all of this stuff happens. Like, you'll hear a lot of scholars talk about intersectionality, so how people have these different identities that experience things like racism, sexism, those sorts of things based upon their different identities, and they can all converge. But in this whole idea about intersectionality, nobody talks about childhood. I'm like, if we're talking about intersectionality, and you close your eyes and you think about that, the image should not be, you know, a queer, disabled black woman. It should be a child, right? Because children are this blank slate where all of these identities start to get, you know, piled on. And so if we want to shift racism, if we want to shift people's thinking and behaviors, if we want to show empathy and a healthy form of love, we have to start with children. We have to interrogate childism. We talk a lot about racism and these other phobias and such, but not childism. These everyday microaggressions in terms of the way we treat children, the way we see them as property rather than as gods, rather than as return to ancestors, and drawing on the indigenous thinking about the nature of children prior to colonialism. We have to get rid of corporal punishment. Children are the only group of people where it is codified in law that you can hit them appropriately. Every single state has a law that says you can hit your child. 19 states still allow corporal punishment in public schools. Every state, with the exception of New Jersey and Iowa, allows corporal punishment in private and charter schools. So you guys are lucky you're not at a private school in Mississippi, because that Harkness table and the paddle might converge. So it's all, we change this by the ways in which we socialize children, by the way we treat their bodies, by the way we talk about them, by the policies and the environments that we create around them. It's the only way. You don't get a racist without destroying a child. If you're a racist, it's because you were destroyed during childhood. If you're a misogynist, you were destroyed somehow in childhood. That's the only way that I see us trying to heal any of this.
Hi, thanks again for your presentation. I wanted to ask, your presentation centered a lot on like racial violence as a spectacle to indoctrinate white children, what you called, I think at one point, the fraternity of whiteness. And I wonder though, like, a lot of the conversations I've had around like racism now, talk a lot about how white people are often blind to the black experience, and there's so much racial violence that is invisible, especially to white people. Do you think that being totally naive to racial inequity can be similarly dangerous to being exposed to it in such a violent circumstance?
So that's a great question. As you were talking, I was thinking about Jane Elliott, who is a white anti-racist, very famous woman. She was famous for her blue-eyed, brown-eyed study. She has this great video that's gone viral on social media. She's in an auditorium full of white people. And so she poses a question. She says, how many of you white people would like to trade places with black people? And there's silence. And she's like, I don't think you understood the question. How many of you would like to trade places with black people? Raise your hands. Nobody raised their hands. And the fact that they didn't raise their hands let her know that they do know what's up. They are aware of racism. They are aware that there's this violence and disproportionate treatment and, you know, access to resources and stuff. So I don't believe that there's naivete and that there's blindness or ignorance. This is a system that was not created by its victims. This is a system that benefits white people to varying degrees, depending on your class, your ethnic background, and so on and so forth. So I just don't buy that people, you know, don't know. White supremacy does rely on cognitive dissonance, yeah, like just pretending not to know. People do know, they just choose to look the other way or to be in denial about what's going on. There's one up here. So here, it's one up here. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to, so you mentioned that, like, I guess this white supremacy is sort of embedded within the psyches of these children, which obviously is like a really heartbreaking phenomenon that happens, but is there anything like we can do as like people who haven't had this experience, like do to help people unlearn this or have them like unembed this sort of idea within their minds? Like, is there anything we can do? And obviously, like, there's no like definitive or simple response to this today, so to hear your opinion.
That's a tough question, and depending on my mood, I could answer it a number of ways. You know, sometimes I feel like, you know, we can maybe educate people out of this, that we can, you know, expose them to the archives and tell a nuanced story of this history, which is precisely why things like critical race theory are under attack right now. There would be a whole lot of people who are angry that I'm having this lecture right here, right now, right? So, so it's learning, it's reading, It's recognizing the historical echoes, but you first got to face history first to know that, oh my God, this is history repeating itself again, right? And being actively anti-racist, calling things out when you see it. And so sometimes I'm a little cynical when I come out of the archives and I just see so much evil in there. And I look around and I see the hate and I hear it today. I told my students the other day, we were just doing active shooter, I did active shooter training in my classroom on Tuesday at Howard because we had 3 bomb threats in the past few weeks and 13 HBCUs were targeted. And I'm like, I can't believe we're doing this again. And so when you go into the past to try to explain how and why evil things could happen and try to pull out some lessons and some sort of explanation and hope that, okay, these truths that you find will motivate people to do something different. Certainly there will be some people who will be compelled to do that, to not, repeat this history. But when I look around this country, and particularly the January 6th Capitol riots, and I saw the news folks saying, this is not America. And I said, this looks like a lynching that's about to happen. They bought a guillotine. They bought a hanging apparatus, right? I heard all the howling. I saw the Confederate flags and the smoke. It was very familiar to me. And I have those moments where I'm like, this is embedded, in generations of people who have been traumatized, in their own communities, in their own families. They have this ancestral history carried in their bodies that they haven't reckoned with. I don't know how you purge other people's bodies. And particularly when you belong to groups of color, where we know that racism is not static, that it's always being refined and changed, and we're trying to put one foot in front of the other to stay alive, to keep our kids from being murdered. How can we be the victims, the patients and the doctors? How do we figure out how to fix these people? I don't know. So like I said, depending on my mood, some days I'm like, I don't know, we can't do this. And other days I'm a little bit more hopeful. And this is why I focus on young people, because your brains are not fully developed yet, and maybe I could sneak into your psyches a sense of fire and justice and get you so disturbed by what you saw here tonight that you'll be compelled to say, I'm not repeating this history. Yes. Okay, right here and then here.
First, thank you for coming back to this campus and bringing such a powerful presentation with you. And my question is, being such a systematically embedded concept, especially of how love may be the largest factor towards these racist, the existence of these racist ideologies of hate, do you think that we have, or we are closer to being considered or have progressed as a society in the opposite direction, or do you think it may be more towards modernization to the point where it may not be what it's not?
So the question is about progress. Certainly we've made some progress. But then sometimes, depending on my mood, I say we shouldn't have been enslaving people in the first place. Shouldn't have been lynching people in the first place. So what does that say about other people's humanity? That to not kill people should be celebrated as progress, right? Certainly, there's more opportunities. There are certain barriers that have, been broken down. But this is an intergenerational project to sort of sustain some of the rights. I mean, look, they're trying to take away our voting rights, right? Teachers are under attack. I just read a piece about in Oklahoma where any teacher that is caught teaching anything that's contrary to religion, evolution, LGBTQ issues, those sorts of things, can be fined $10,000. This is a real bill before the Oklahoma State Legislature. And so there's tons of these bills. They're very busy right now trying to turn back the clock on things like reproductive rights, on civil rights, on access to education. Teachers are leaving the profession. What better way to intellectually disable the future of a biracial, diverse group of radical young people than to take away their teachers and to put them into college education systems where they come out with so much debt that they have to focus on just working instead of activism and thinking and undoing, these systems. So yeah, there's progress, but there's always, every time there's some progress, there are people who are trying to put us back. Make America great again. We know what that means. And so we have to stay vigilant. And it's not just the old people. We always think, oh, it's the old rednecks who are impending dinosaurs who are sustaining all of this. I think of Kyle Rittenhouse. I think of the 6 juveniles that the FBI are investigating right now for launching threats against my university and other HBCUs. So it's people your age who grew up in those environments, those toxic environments, who are inheriting that intergenerational legacy of perverse love and racial ideology and fear and so forth. So yeah, progress, but what does it mean when your starting point is, pathological, homicidal, barbarism? Is it really progress or just being a basic human? Some, right here?
Hand back there, I think. Yes. Pass the, if you want to pass the mic. Hello? You turn on the mic.
Yeah, you'll have to speak really loud so I can hear you.
Oh, sure. My question is not directly related to your actual presentation, but more to your story which you have talked about this morning. So, being first Black girl in your house, first foster kid to attend the school, it makes you unique in a way. And being unique sometimes can be very hard when you see everyone else going with the flow and blending in together. Is there any specific thing that kept you strong and courageous when you would go through hard times?
Mm-hmm. Let me have a sip of vodka before I answer that. I do that with my students, but I take the label off and they are like, oh my God, she's really drinking in class. So sports was a big part of that for me. Being an athlete gave me that outlet, to move my body, to become strong, to express, artistry, so to speak. There were people on this campus, certain teachers, staff members that I connected with, who nurtured my voice, who smiled when I entered the room, who asked how I was doing, who would sit down next to me in the dining center and say, how are things going, right? And they made me feel like, I belonged and, always appreciated my authenticity. But I was also clear in my mission when I came to this school. I was not coming here to become white, right? I was not coming here to escape blackness or to escape my family or to escape my community or to be better than those people back there, even the foster kids that were left behind at the group home. I came back to that group home to do my community service because I wanted them to see me and to send a very strong message that, you are architects of your own future and that you have agency and that you don't have to be constricted by these labels like foster kid, adoptee, right? Or, your racial ethnic identity and these, sort of scripts that people affix to them. And so I was clear about that mission. So anything that didn't jibe with my spirit, I rejected it. I liken it to being like a spaghetti strainer. I took what worked for me in this experience and I threw the rest away, right? Virginia Woolf didn't work for me, right? But Ralph Ellison, I found some lessons. Even in Harold and Maude and all their freakiness, right? It was about love. I could find some universal messages, even in those experiences and identities that were different from mine. So it was in those spaces that I was able to get some validation. And also, you know, there were moments when, you know, whether it was on the athletic field or getting on the stage at Kirby Arts Center, and having your classmates applaud you and saying, good job. You know, coming back here today, I don't know about you, Zahir, but I was choking back tears when we were doing that selfie, and to look back and this whole community was standing up behind me and applauding and appreciated the message and welcomed me back. That just made my heart beat really fast. And it was so redemptive and so healing. And I'm so glad that I got to come back to do that. Oh, there's like 2 more hands, 3 more hands.
I think we are, in the interest of time, we'll take the
One more.
remaining hands. So
Okay.
I see 1.
These 2 down here in the front.
So
have their
there's
hands.
2, okay, and there's 1 up there. So 4. That's it. And then we,
Bye. You gotta go home.
all right. If you can pass the mic.
First, I want to say thank you again.
Where's the voice coming
you're-
from? Okay.
And your talk reminded me of this phrase I said before, that you're a product of your environment. And you talked about this neurological trauma and injury that's generational, and that leads to this desensitization and perpetuation of violence, even in today's society. And I was wondering, in what ways can you resensitize people to violence and images and situations that they've been desensitized to in communities?
So I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I imagine a couch and a therapist might help. That's the simplest way that I can. I'm a historian and a journalist. So as a journalist, I document and write the first draft of history. As a historian, I go back and say, look what I found, right? And this is how it happened, why it happened. So we're generally not in the business of like trying to fix people, fix cultures, but in hope we do produce things in hopes that people will use them as part of the process to awaken them about these particular issues. So I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm hoping that people do this work, right? So that maybe some psychologists, developmental psychologists, neuroscientists will pick this work up and read this and say, oh, wow. You know, so how could we use this understanding of how violence got passed on through generations and help to perpetuate racism to try to focus on childhood in a different way, right? In terms of the treatment of kids and in their spaces build upon this work. That's my hope.
So we'll take the one up that was upstairs.
My question was actually basically the same thing as Summer's.
Okay.
Okay. So that's
Yeah,
it?
we're good.
Okay, so if you can pass the mic forward to the questions that were in the front. And these will be the final questions. Thank you all.
My question is kind of, I don't know if it makes it sensical to an extent, but I've been like reimagining what love is specifically, and looking into this and looking into what you define love, and I think the main thing that I see is like the idea of cathexis. Like in Bell was all about love, she describes cathexis and what love is, and how you can't love someone if you're like implementing harmful ideas into them. So I feel that there's a lot of like cathexis, like these white parents are putting on this cathexis more than love, because they're investing so much of their white supremacist ideas in their kids instead of actually loving them and then harming them. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And it also works for African Americans as well. So in my community, I'm also an activist, anti-spanking activist. So I'm trying to get people to stop beating their kids and calling it love, right? And protection and all of this. We reframe violence as something that's good. And we only do this with children. Like you would never say, you know, there's, you know, to a spouse, I hit you because I love, we reject that. But when it comes to children, it's just, you know, completely normal. And so, and I have black people who will say that, you know, not beating your kid is white, that's acting white. And I actually reframe it and I say, actually beating your child is one of the whitest things you can do to destroy them. Because if you understand the history of corporal punishment and this sort of ritualized violence against children begins in Europe and is a product of colonialism and slavery and internalized racism. And so we too have to unpack and reframe how we think about love, how we think about children, right, and their nature. And so much of that is mixed in with, you know, Western Christianity and those sorts of ideas, misinterpretation of the Bible, spare the rod, spoil the child, which is not even in the Bible. So we've got so much to unpack in our thinking and in our interpretation of Scripture, in our interpretation of, you know, the nature and place of children and how we treat them. So much of what we call love is so perverted and distorting for not just white children, but for other children growing up in this white supremacist ecosystem. It's a smog that we're all sort of breathing in and internalizing, sometimes very unconsciously. And then we continue to perpetuate those ideas throughout, you know, generation. We all think we're loving each other when we're really distorting and dehumanizing each other. It's a sad story. Okay.
Final question, was there?
It's on now. My question was, where do non-Black people of color, I guess mixed kids, and Black immigrants, like where do they stand and play a role in this upholding of white supremacy through children?
So those non-African American, native-born Black people are also products of colonization, right? So Africa, the Caribbean, so they too need to reckon with those histories. How did colonialism change our ideas about parenting, about the nature of children, how we do economics, how we do education, how we do religion, how we do our food ways, right? It's that smog, it's a diasporic smog of, you know, toxicity. And so they also have to do that work and understand when they come here as part of the immigrant experience, what ideas are they internalizing about Black Americans? What were they told about us before coming into this space? And so they have to do that work of unpacking those ideas and learning about the history of racism. Sometimes when you come from majority Black countries and spaces with different, you know, historical trajectories, like maybe there's no Jim Crow in those, you know, on certain islands or certain African countries. They are the majority. They are the norm, right? So how does that change when you get here into this context in terms of how they move, how they think of themselves, how they look at other people of color throughout the diaspora? So liberation is a diasporic project that we all must be participating in. Decolonization is a project that we all have to be, you know, participating in so that we can have healthier collaborations among different groups of people, indigenous groups, non-African American people of color as well. So there's a lot of healing all across the board and deconstruction that has to happen. And with that, I'm tired.
Thank you all again for joining us for this program. I have to shout out two more people that I forgot. I told y'all don't charge it to my heart but my head. And that was Assistant Head of School Marquis Scott and Anisha Hunter, who brought some members of her student class here. Thank you for that support.
Get that extra credit.
Yeah, get that. Feel free to avail yourself of the gingered peach cookies in the next room in the water. Again, you can't eat or drink in here, but you can eat or drink over there. Thank you all again. Have a good evening. And we look forward to seeing you at our future programs.